as we know that this is like the festive season in India here, and thank you very much, all of you, to take a time out of your festive merriment perspective and joining us today online. We have Dany Prince today, who is speaking on I Am an Appetite, Vampires as Crisis and Nexus of Sexuality. Dany Prince is already among us today. Dany, if you could open your cam. Yeah. So Danny's topic is today I'm an Appetite, Vampires as Crisis, Sexuality. Dany Prince is a 31-year-old indigenous academic studying at Howard University. Their areas of specialization include the Gothic, Victorian literature, and literary theory, but they also have vested interest in pop culture studies. They have previously published work on Victorian literature, Marjorie Lewis' comic Monstrous, and have presented works on Dracula, The Beetle, and The Haunting of the Hill House. So, Dany, over to you, and thank you
All
for
right.
joining us as one of the speakers today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited. I've been like rereading Dracula and like other vampire literature. I love vampires, obviously. So I have my little Dracula in the corner.
Okay, and your t-shirts also like it looks like some.
Care Bear Dracula. I got it online and I was like, should I wear it today? Should I not wear it today? And I was like, no, I have to wear it today because
It's a limited edition occasion. So thank you, Danny, for joining us. You can start ahead with the presentation.
okay, perfect. Let me grab my. I'm trying to. Let me grab my presentation.
Yeah, fine. We have people joining and also like sounds of crackers in the background. It's Diwali time in India.
Uh, I've seen like a few celebrations here. Oh, that is not the right screen. Hold on. I have to grab my third screen.
No problem. Take your time.
There we go.
Okay, so
All right, can you see? Perfect.
yes, it's visible.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to be presenting, like you said, about vampires. I'm going to be primarily focusing on Dracula because it's one of my special interests, and Dracula is just such a fun story. So when it was initially published, Dracula was actually met with middling acclaim. The Pall Mall Gazette called the novel horrid and creepy to the last degree, and other reviews for it cited Stoker's ability to invoke the monstrous, the unnatural, and the gruesome. But despite then a less than enthusiastic initial response, Stoker's novel is really integral to our understanding of the modern vampire, and there's been innumerable adaptations throughout the 20th and 21st centuries of Dracula. Like, obviously, there's Nosferatu, which I believe was released in the 1920s or the 1910s. And then there's also properties like Batman and Dracula, Hotel Transylvania, Dracula Untold, Van Helsing. Stoker's Dracula is a challenge and an external threat, but not only to the hunters, but also the women of Victorian London too. And this is also a theme that Robert Eggers picks up in his adaptation of Nosferatu with the relationship between Ellen Hutter and Count Orlok. I don't talk a lot about Nosferatu in this, mostly because I don't think I'll have the time, and talking about Nosferatu is kind of like a whole other beast in and of itself. But for both Eggers and Stoker, the body of the vampire becomes this crisis and nexus of sexuality where gender exists outside of signification. So recent popular culture depictions of vampires like Twilight have defanged vampires and reduces them to passive and romantic entities that pursue human women out of romantic and sexual desire. You can see that obviously in Twilight, but you can also see it in the TV show The Vampire Diaries, which also spins off the originals. And then there's Hotel Transylvania, who, like, where Dracula kind of becomes this like paragon of lost love, and like this, his daughter Mavis becomes like this bridge between the monster world and the human world. But though the sexual aspect of this pursuit is a theme that remains in Dracula, the threatening aspect is kind of lost in contemporary popular culture depictions of vampires. For example, Edward Cullen repeatedly tells us that he's a threat, but he's never once a physical or a sexual threat to Bella Swan, and the same occurs in vampiric media like the originals and the Vampire Diaries. And it really isn't until Nosferatu this past year that vampires become a force to be reckoned with all over again. Like Le Fanu's Carmilla, Stoker's Dracula is a challenge and external threat to the hunters through the repeated violation of not only their bodies, but Lucy and Mina's bodies as well. In particular, femininity becomes a problem throughout the novel because it becomes this form of sexual anarchy and monstrosity. And Stoker so intimately writes about the chaos and the horrific nature of vampiric sexuality that sexuality becomes this driving force behind the hysteria that he depicts, not only through Lucy's possession, but also in Harker's experience at Castle Dracula. So the first thing I kind of want to look at is how Victorians and 19th century Americans kind of defined masculinity. And in 1894, Lucinda B. Chandler publishes an article with the Free Thought magazine, and it's titled The Mother Godhood of Deific Being. So Chandler was an American social reformer, and her work primarily focuses on the coexistence of spiritualism and suffrage. Her first article was Motherhood, Its Power Over Human Destiny. But in Mother Godhood, she concerns herself with defining masculinity and femininity and how both kind of coexist with one another. I'm really interested in how Chandler defines masculinity, and she writes that the masculine precedes the gods of the Old Testament, and the gods of the Old Testament were purely masculine conceptions, implacable, jealous of prerogative, contentious for supremacy, and unforgiving. Chandler believes that masculinity becomes a problem that cannot inherently coexist with femininity. And she writes, it is impossible for masculinity to comprehend femininity and vice versa. Each is a distinct principle incomplete without the cooperation of the other. And she uses the little o other, but as a distinction between these two. But I find her word choice really interesting here because of how the mention of this other also ties to the concept of like the Lacanian other and like the psychoanalytic other. And within this conversation of what masculinity and femininity both are and how they coexist, Chandler uniquely creates this dichotomy between the two and recognizes the role of the other within discussions of gender and gender roles. Though Chandler reconciles masculinity and femininity in her article, I want to bring special attention to this implication because of the Gothic tradition and how it positions femininity as other to masculinity. For example, in The Monk, Matilda and Antonia both become objects of Ambrosio's desire, and as the story progresses, Matilda becomes othered because of her ties to witchcraft and demonology. In Castle of Otranto, Isabel is simultaneously desired and vilified by Manfred, Jerome, and Theodore. And later on in the novel, Manfred's daughter, Matilda, is murdered by Manfred. Crises of sexuality and gender have been at the core of the social dynamics within the Gothic genre, and though Chandler's work isn't necessarily analyzing Gothic literature, the arguments that she presents about gender can extend to how dichotomies of gender is treated within contemporary 19th century literature. So Dracula's fundamental purpose is to pose a threat to Victorian civil society. He individually threatens Jonathan Harker, uses his career as a way for Dracula to ingratiate himself into Victorian London. He socially challenges the Hunters and Van Helsing and sexually threatens Lucy Westenra and Mina Harker. In chapter 23, he boasts that your girls that you all love are mine already, and though you and others shall yet be mine, my creatures to do my bidding and to be my jackals when I want to feed. And From Demons to Dracula, the creation of the modern vampire myth, Matthew Beresford compares Stoker's Dracula to Jack the Ripper, calling Jack the Ripper one of the most sadistic serial killings in history, and that the news of a woman being attacked by a well-dressed man who seized her by the throat again throws up parallels with Dracula. And though we meet Dracula at his castle in Harker's journals, we can finally fully address the threat that he poses when we read the logs from the Demeter. So it is here now, I know it. On the watch last night I saw it, like a man tall and thin and ghastly pale. It was in the bows, and looking out, I crept behind it and gave it my knife, but the knife went through it, empty as air. And as he spoke, he took his knife and drove it savagely into space. Then he went on, but it is here, and I shall find it. It is in the hold, perhaps in one of those boxes. And this particular entry occurs a few days after Dracula has kind of been haunting and hunting the sailors and the crewmen of the Demeter, and he's slowly rendering them mad. The language that the first mate uses here is particularly interesting to me because Dracula is appearing as a wealthy gentleman, but there's still this otherworldly, animalistic suspect or aspect to how the sailors view them. And when the captain describes the first mate action of stabbing the air as savage, Stoker is deliberately painting these men as driven to this animalistic savagery through madness. And the use of the word savage is like deliberately racially coded too, because Dracula is this like Eastern European threat, and like through Stoker's depiction and descriptions of Dracula, Dracula is kind of this anti-Semitic figure. So using this racially coded language further drives home the fact that like Dracula is driving these people to madness, and like those Victorian sensibilities of like, oh god, what's the word? Like where they're just like prim and proper, like it's slowly unraveling. So Stoker's linking of animals to vampires, for example, Dracula can shape change into wolves, rats, bats, same with his wives. It's deliberate and even extends to when Lucy begins to transform into a vampire. Stoker even describes his wives, or the wives, as animalistic, which extends into Harker's seduction by these vampire women. Though Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula is an adaptation of the text, Coppola fundamentally misunderstands the driving force behind Dracula and mistakes it for this chasm between the godly and the unholy. In his director's commentary for Dracula, Coppola mentions that the driving force behind Dracula and his desire to infiltrate London is because of his unholiness. He says that Dracula is fundamentally and inherently a man of God, which is really not true when we look at Dracula in Stoker's novel. Dracula is instead a vehicle for Stoker to examine this tension between old and new technologies. And Dracula relies on older forms of technology like ships, whereas hunters rely on contemporary technology like telegrams and blood transfusions and steam power, all of these things. So I want to talk a little bit about the angel in the house ideology. The angel in the house ideology is an ideology that emerges out of American literature, and initially was a narrative poem by Coventry Patmore that was published in 1854. The poem depicts sexual and gender ideals for women. The angel in the house is the perfect wife and represents male concerns that motivate that fascination. And when we see Lucy as a human, she is an angel in the house ideology. She is the object of desire for Quincy Morris and Dr. Seward and Lord Godalming. And she gets 3 marriage proposals in one day, which she like writes in her letters to Mina. She's like, "Oh my God, can you believe it? Don't tell the other girls though, because then they're going to expect to get 6 proposals." So Lucy is this object of desire for these men. But once she turns, she becomes this perverted ideal of femininity, and which really comes to a head once she dies and transforms into the Bloofer Lady. She preys on children, which is an inherently perverse act because she's supposed to be this mother figure. She's supposed to be this angel in the house. And this also extends to how the Victorian men are emasculated. Dracula indirectly feeds on them, except for Harker, whom he supposedly loves. And Dracula poses this threat to the purity of Victorian women and the sexual prowess of Victorian men. He can possess women by feeding off of their blood and indirectly feeds on the men because of how Van Helsing and Seward utilize modern blood transfusions to prolong Lucy's life. The act of feeding and the movement of blood from one body to another is ultimately this transference of masculinity. And this is a theme that also emerges in Marcia's novel, The Beetle. So in her article, Leaky Bodies, Leslie Allen presents the male body as this porous entity. And though she primarily focuses on the beetle, these ideas can also extend to Dracula as well. The hunters willingly sacrifice themselves and end up becoming subjugates of Lucy's. Their bodily fluids imbue Lucy with masculinity and perverts the traditional gender roles of the penetrator versus the penetrated. The male body is porous and fragile, the ideal of masculinity challenged. And the hunters end up so driven to reassert their sexual and gender dominance that nothing else matters to them. But then Lucy's body is also leaky. Dracula consistently feeds on her. He manages to control her until the hunters sacrifice themselves. Though Allen describes Holt's leakiness in this matter, the same can be ascribed to Lucy's porosity. She writes that the beetle's control exhausts Holt's body, which in turn becomes grotesque. Fluid exchange with the environment through sweat, blood, and mud renders his body porous and open as opposed to bounded and closed. In Dracula, the biggest like 1-to-1 ratio for this is the 2 tiny pinpricks on the side of Lucy's neck, because that is the porosity. That's where the blood leaks out. And with this transference of power, we also see this division of hysteria and the Lacanian real. So Lucy is a manifestation of the Lacanian real, whereas Harker's experience is a representation of the uncanny and how the uncanny influences his own hysteria. So Annalene Messeline has this book. It's called The Unconcept, and she talks about like her own experience and her own aesthetic response to the uncanny. So the Lacanian real, it resists its signification and it exists outside of our world orders. So for Lacan, our world is divided up into these 3 registers: the imaginary and the symbolic orders. The imaginary is like our visual kind of realm, like where we see things and experience things, whereas the symbolic order is where language lives. And our world attempts to signify everything around us, but the real cannot be signified. We can only attempt to signify it. And in this, the uncanny kind of emerges as like a pre-Lacanian thing, like not only through like Freud and his works, but like the uncanny is akin to like this uncanny valley effect in film. Like you can see it in the Stepford Wives, if you've seen the Stepford Wives. And the uncanny is more of a psychological aesthetic response to something that feels oddly familiar but horrifying all the same. And the experience of uncanniness teaches us that the stranger is not someone who threatens us from the outside, but rather the strange is inside us and our identity is already contaminated. And from here, we can move on to the notion of sexual anarchy. So, sexual anarchy occurs where traditional notions of manhood and womanhood are under siege. And Mark McHale kind of goes through this in his book, Hysterical Men and the History of the Male Nervous Illness. Um, so, the women in Dracula have this inherent sexual power, and it magnifies when the women become vampires. So the sexual power of the vampiric women is what induces hysteria, especially in Jonathan Harker. Harker takes on this role as sexual prey, and his inability to comprehend it drives him to delirium. His experience with the vampire women inherently changes him, and it's actually like really well done in Coppola's film, where on the left you can see that he still has his brown hair, and he's this is before he leaves London. But on the right, his hair goes white after his experience with the women. And I find that to be such like a really good physical representation of how fundamentally like hysteria and these traumatic moments kind of change who we are through physical means. And Mina also reflects more contemporary values on gender. Van Helsing praises her for having a man's brain, and this compliment reflects that Mina embodies the masculine principle of modern sensibility and the feminine principles of empathy, love, and compassion. And though it's not like overtly stated, I do kind of interpret the fact that she has like this man's brain, and like she's able to reconcile more like masculine, like business, political kind of influences with her compassion and her empathy and her love. And that's ultimately like why she's able to resist Dracula for so long. Like, Van Helsing also uses like hypnotism to kind of bridge that gap between Mina and Dracula so that they can use Mina's connection to capture Dracula. And from here, like I do want to talk like very, very briefly about the monstrous feminine. Um, and so Barbara Creed's work on the monstrous feminine is foundational to gender studies and examining women in horror studies. But Robert King also has an article titled A Regiment of Monstrous Women that I find particularly interesting, especially when looking at how women are written in classic literature, especially monstrous women. So Barbara Creed develops her ideas on the monstrous feminine in her book, but King divides monstrous women into 7 different categories: scary young girls, sexual predators, predatory dangerous, man eaters, predatory slash dangerous women eaters, possessed mothers, vengeful mothers, and postmenopausal Machiavellian manipulators. Specifically, Lucy and the Vampire Brides fit into possessed mothers, predatory slash dangerous man eaters, and scary young girls. So Lucy herself is kind of this aspect of scary young girls, uh, and her transformation becomes this metaphor for puberty, where, like, with one of the driving forces behind King's work is that um, sorry, I'm trying to find my notes, where he argues that like the girls are experiencing menstruation for the first time, and though Lucy is very clearly like an older woman, or like at marriage age, she's not actively menstruating, but instead like the substitute is when Dracula feeds on her, and having her transform into a vampire becomes this metaphor for puberty because she's finally like sexually developed. She like when the hunters go into her crypt to ultimately stop her, like stake her through the heart, she still tries to seduce Holmwood, and he almost falls for it, but the hunters, like, they all kind of like wrestle him back. And then finally they're able to reassert their dominance. Able to reassert their sexuality by staking her. And the stake here becomes like this representation of the phallic and male domination over female domination. And so like all of these elements of Dracula end up fusing together to ultimately unsettle both readers and Victorian masculinity with femininity and the Eastern other, because again, like Dracula is Eastern European, and they become the biggest problems for Harker and Hunter. Dracula does not end in tragedy, except for Quincy Morris dying, which I personally think is one of the saddest deaths in classic literature. But we also don't feel sympathy for the Count because Harker and Quincy kill him. There's this element of tragedy to be found with Lucy and Quincy, and perhaps the idea behind the novel is to show how the Victorians, while presuming they are safe, are actually unsafe and easily penetrable. Dracula is easily able to penetrate and infiltrate all of the Victorian bodies that exist in Dracula, which portrays him as this incredible threat and a challenge to all of these Victorian ideals. In fact, all of Dracula and his brides, including Lucy, refuse to be this noble quantity for the hunters, as well as becoming this excess of force and uncanniness. And all of these elements are the driving forces behind the hysteria that becomes prominent with the text. It also begs the question of how safe are we within these spheres that we trust to be impenetrable? And yeah, so these are the articles that I referenced here. This is kind of like a pet project. I reread Dracula every so often because it's one of my favorite novels. And I do want to like work on this more, especially for my dissertation. But these are the articles that I have referenced here today and ones that I believe to be like kind of foundational in this research. And yeah.
So thank you, Danny. It was, as the article and the referred site refers to, like, this is a very loaded talk, though it was a very, like, in a short presentation you have managed to touch on many things, like the angel in the house, the porous bodies of men, the advanced understanding of masculinity in the Victorian period, sexual hierarchy, hysteria, and the monstrous feminine. Like, there are many things that you actually touch, and I'm sure that there will be questions regarding this. I open the floor uh, to all who are present in the meet. You can unmute yourself directly and ask questions to Dany if you have any questions to her. Garima actually says that thank you, Dany. It's an amazing presentation. She has actually put it in the text of the meet, the text box.
No, thank you so much.
So maybe I can start, and then the audience might like pitch in, and they can like pitch in the questions. You were talking about the angel in the house, right? So like, in what ways does the characterization of Lucy and Mina creates a cultural dichotomy between the angel in the house and the fallen woman, in accordance with like late Victorian concepts of female sexuality, conceptions of female sexuality?
Let me grab my original essay because there is. I looked at the poem late last night because until I was writing about this, I had no idea that The Angel in the House was actually a poem. And when I was like getting together, sorry, my dog is whining. When I was getting things together, I was looking things up again and I was like, oh my God, this is a poem. And I found it really interesting that it's a poem written by an American. Whereas, like, The Angel in the House, like, the Victorians were obsessed with it, and it emerges so much in later Victorian literature. Like, we can see it in, like, Jane Eyre, and we can see it in The Beetle. In The Beetle, it becomes a lot more predominant because of Marjorie and how, like, she's this ideal woman. She doesn't infiltrate in Lessingham's spaces. She just allows him to be this like political force, even though her father is a political figure too, and she has all of this experience with politics. But she kind of like steps aside. let Lessingham do that. And there's this line. Let me grab it. There's this line in the poem. I think I had it up on my slides. Sorry, my computer's slow.
It's perfectly fine. We have time.
Yeah, so man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure. Down the gulf of his condoled necessities, she casts her best, she flings herself. So the angel in the house ideology implies that women are inherently predisposed to dominate the domestic sphere, so child rearing, keeping house, all of that, while men dominate these social spheres like professional and political spheres. And so Lucy in particular is interesting because she actively pursues all of the men at one point or another, and you can see it in Coppola's Dracula more explicitly than you can see it in Dracula, because I think in the novel she's very clearly more interested in Holmwood than Seward or Quincy Morris. But in Coppola's Dracula, she kind of like actively sexually pursues all of the men. And when Quincy is showing her his Bowie knife, she's like, "Oh my god, it's so big." Like actively flirting with him. And so she kind of like infiltrates that kind of like sexual sphere to the point where she's actively pursuing them. She's actively showing her sexual prowess, which kind of foreshadows the role that she takes as a vampire bride. And so I think like the angel in the house ideology, Mina is becomes more like representative of it than Lucy does. And talking briefly about Nosferatu, I think that Ellen's friend, I can't remember her name, she is more representative of the angel in the house ideology with like her children and how passive she is and like how she doesn't challenge her husband's ideas of like Ellen needs to be like Ellen is hysteric, Ellen needs to be tied up or whatever.
Yeah. So while you were like searching out the results, I Shalu actually commented it's an amazing session, Danny. So congratulations pouring in and like wishes as well, and all the more importantly, questions as well. We have a question from Nurjahan Khatun. What psychological or sociological needs do you think the figure of the vampire fulfills for a modern audience, especially for the fact that you started off like vampires do not are not viewed as that threatening while you were like starting your talk today. So Nurjan's question is like psychological or sociological needs the figure of vampire fulfills for a modern audience like us, you and I, and for everyone present here.
Okay. That's a really good question. I haven't really thought of that before, but I do think that like so the vampire initially emerges as like this theme of like reverse colonization. You can see elements of reverse colonization anxieties throughout like literature from the 1890s. Like I've said it again, like the Beetle is a really good representation of this, especially um, because of how the Beetle is a priestess of Isis from Egypt, and then she kind of infiltrates Victorian London, and she straddles the line between masculine and feminine. But in more contemporary literature, I think the vampire kind of fulfills a sexual need because the vampire is human and also not. And I think the vampire and like the pursuit of the vampiric and like this sexual attraction to the vampire um, is purposefully sexual because it's the closest we can get to like the pursuit of the monstrous without like going towards like bestiality or actively pursuing like monsters, like the creature from the Black Lagoon or Godzilla. I think Edward Cullen is a really like I've been rereading Twilight because as an Indigenous scholar, like I always like to look at very blatantly racist Indigenous like depictions of Indigenous characters, and like Twilight is wildly racist. It's written by a white Mormon woman. It's gonna be racist. It's gonna be awful, and it's gonna like focus on these gender ideals between like men and women. And Edward Cullen isn't a true vampire in the way that we think of vampires, but he does kind of like pivot from like vampires as monsters to like this romantic ideal. We're fascinated with him. And why are we fascinated with him? It's because he's uncanny. I think that like psychologically the vampire has kind of transitioned from the real to the uncanny, and because it's more uncanny, I think we can reconcile their monstrosity much easier than um than if the vampire is truly a monster.
Yeah, thank you, Danny, for that. Vishwajit is asking, like, is saying that it was a representation. Now, if you could share the list of works that you have discussed or referred to, that
Oh
actually,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, let me put it up on the screen again.
yes.
There you go.
I think Vishwajit, it is now visible now, like the articles to which Danny is referred. In
Yeah.
time, we have a
Then
question.
should
We have a question. Yeah, it is visible, I can say. We have a question from Garima. Uh, she asks, how do representations of vampirism serve as metaphors for exploring taboo or marginalized sexual identities in literature and popular cultures?
Great question. So vampires I think are also kind of Dracula in particular. I don't think Stoker very deliberately positions Dracula as kind of like this bisexual figure, because when the brides initially attack Harker and like seduce him in Castle Dracula, um, Dracula interrupts them saying like how dare you, and he's like yeah. So Harker, he sees the women and he describes the women as like there was a deliberate voluptuousness which was both thrilling and repulsive, and as she arched her neck she actually licked her lips like an animal. And then later on, like a page later, uh, Dracula says, how dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast his eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you'll have to deal with me. The fair girl, with a laugh of ribald coquetry, turned to answer him. You yourself never loved. You never love. And then a paragraph later, then the Count turned after looking at my face attentively and said in a soft whisper, yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is it not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go, go. I must awaken him, for there is work to be done. And so, especially following the wild trials of the 1890s, like homosexuality throughout like colonial history has been reviled and persecuted, and the wild trials are like a really good indication of that. So but Stoker I think deliberately positions Dracula as this like bisexual figure because he both pursues Lucy, but I also don't think that like his pursuit of Lucy was like an emotional response to it. I think that Lucy becomes a means to an end for Dracula, whereas like his true desire lies with Jonathan Harker. And when Jonathan Harker kind of rebukes that, he turns his gaze to Mina, and Mina then becomes a means to an end, and he's jealous and he pursues Mina because, well, I mean, like, that's his boyfriend's girlfriend. That's his boyfriend's wife. So obviously he's going to get his revenge. So I think that, like, inherently the figure of the vampire is a representation of marginalized sexual identity and, like, also gender identity. And if you've seen Castlevania, Alucard is kind of like that too, because he's very much, like, positioned as a twink, if you know what that is, but, like, this very effeminate man, whereas his father Dracula is this, like, very sexy hero, like, I fell in love with a woman and then they killed her and now I hate everyone and I'm going to kill everyone. But Alucard is, like, fighting his father. So I think that vampires are inherently marginalized sexual identities, or, like, even gender identity, if that makes sense.
Yes, that perfectly makes sense. Like many readings of Dracula actually refer to like how the text actually evocates the repressed sexual desires. Now, I have one last question. If the audience doesn't have any question, I keep on sitting the privilege of asking questions to the persons or resource persons that we have host on Victorian Sundays. I would ask once again, like, do you have questions? If you have questions, you can directly unmute yourself and ask the questions related to Danny. Or if you want that there are background noises, you can write down the questions in the chat box and I will read it for you. And Danny has kindly consented to answer your questions. So if you have questions, you can ask questions by unmuting yourself directly. You're talking about the porous bodies. Now I'm coming to my question. You're talking about porous bodies, and I found that interesting. So I was thinking, like, if those feeding scenes in Dracula can be read against the backdrop of like Michel Foucault's theories on discourse of sexuality, and what these porous bodies can reveal about power, control, and transgression in Victorian body politics.
Okay. Yeah, no, absolutely. So before I read Dracula, I read The Beetle. I read both in my undergrad initially, and in my undergrad, like, I read The Beetle in my later Victorian literature class, and we talked a lot about The Beetle. And the article that I pulled up, Leaky Bodies, Masculinity Narrative and Imperial Decay in Richard Marsh's The Beetle, Leslie Allen does such a good job of, like, talking about leaky bodies and porosity. Um, Let me grab the article. And so, oh my God. And there's also this other article called "Both in Men's Clothing: Gender Sovereignty and Insecurity in Richard Marsh's The Beetle," and I think both of these articles go really well together. But porosity in particular, so porosity, like, the leakiness, is not just, like, the self leaking out of those holes. Porosity also invites the implication that something can enter. So in the beetle is this penetrative, like, masculine force, and in the beginning, when we see Robert Holt, like, going through the streets of Victorian London, and then he's assaulted by the beetle, like, the beetle deliberately enters him through this porosity. So I think that, like, leaky bodies for the Victorians becomes this, like, of crisis of sexuality, this crisis of identity, this crisis of reverse colonization, because the anxieties. That's a good question, Shalu. Sorry, I'm reading the questions and I'm like, oh my God, I have to think about all of these things, and I have so many thoughts. But I think, like, leakiness becomes this force, the driving force of anxiety, because the Victorians are so scared of their space being infiltrated. Like Dracula and the Beatles specifically are these colonized entities, and then they infiltrate like London, and they bring it, like Dracula specifically brings in like soil from Eastern Europe to be able to like live in London. And the Victorians are so mad about that, but it's also because he positions himself as a threat to their women and to their society. So that's how like I think that like leakiness kind of functions in Dracula, if that makes sense. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it was an interesting point, and I will definitely go back to it to read more about it. I have read about porous bodies, but to connect it to like Dracula and the Victorian literature, it really sounds interesting. So I'll get back to it. In the meantime, as you rightly pointed out, we have a very interesting question and a very large art for question for that matter. So it's by Sampriti. She asks, like in Gothic literature, female sexuality often becomes a site of horror as a reflection of Victorian moral anxieties. Right. So that is the question she asked in a conversational tone. This is not really a question, but more of an idea that these works can very much be read alongside colonial Bengali literature's portrayal of women like Binodini, Chokherwali by Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, or Charulata, the film by Satyajit Ray, who disturb the domestic boundaries in subtler yet equally unsettling ways. During your presentation, it struck me. And if you have any thoughts on our observations.
Okay, so I'm less familiar with Bengali literature. I did take a post-colonial literature where we looked at like literature from post-partition in India, but this was like a decade ago, and so again, like I'm not super familiar with Bengali literature. My focus is very much like Victorian literature and like colonial literature and like indigenous literature. But let's
Re, like sorry for interrupting. Let's reorient the question, and if you can answer this question from like the colonial perspective or a post-colonial perspective. If you have any questions from like post-colonial nations where the domestic boundaries were subtly being broken without being referring, without breaking the discourse into like horror or vampirism. If you have any idea.
yeah, so this year, actually, Stephen Graham Jones, who is an Indigenous author, he's Blackfoot. He released a novel called The Buffalo Hunter, which is Indigenous vampires. And if you haven't read it, it's amazing. You need to read it. It's so good. And it has like these elements of Dracula in it. It's also an epistolary novel, which I think is really, really cool because like a lot of popular culture doesn't really do epistolary novels anymore because people are cowards. And uh, and the Buffalo Hunter does this really good like bridging of like more traditional types of literature and like those influences from Dracula and classic literature and the epistolary novel, but also like reconceptualizing it as like this post-colonial wrestling of sexuality, but also like colonial anxieties and like decolonization because Good Stab in The Buffalo Hunter is very, very distinctly anti colonial. He hunts the buffalo hunters, and if you don't know, the buffalo were hunted near to extinction by colonizers in the West because they wanted to make indigenous people like rely on colonial food supplies and like eradicate them. So Good Stab, being this figure that hunts the buffalo hunters, is deliberately like infiltrating these colonial spaces and hunting the colonizers. So highly recommend that novel. Very, very good. Also, Stephen Graham Jones is delightful. He's such a like a great author, and like these are themes that he wrestles with in The Only Good Indians as well, where he looks at like how colonial violence infiltrates indigenous spaces and how men like also become perpetrators of colonial violence against women. Um, but yeah, hopefully that kind of like answers your question or like reconceptualizes it and like brings in like other literature as well. I will definitely take those colonial Bengali literature into advisement. Like I would love to read it. I love reading Indian literature. It's so cool to me.
So that was the transaction of recommendation. Maybe like Humphreys recommended two texts to you, and you recommended the Buffalo Hunter. In the meantime, I've already written it down in the chat box for our participants to look at it, and maybe it is not maybe it is definitely one of the texts that they are going to read in the coming days. Uh, are you comfortable with answering two more questions we have in the chat?
Yeah. I have time. It's Sunday morning. I have nowhere else to be.
Okay, so Shalu asked this question: can gender roles change? Do you think the female protagonist can control and overpower Dracula, using him as a tool to fulfill her wishes or needs?
Yes, absolutely yes. So it I don't think it happens like specifically in Dracula, but I think it happens in adaptations of Dracula. A few years ago, there's this film called The Invitation. I think it came out in 2022, but Dracula is like this old white guy, this old rich British white guy that lives in Britain, and there's this woman who is she's a biracial American woman, and she does like this 23andMe like ancestry test, and then she gets connected with this like other white guy, and he invites her back to like their home for a wedding, and it's very mysterious, and she's like, okay, this person's rich, I want to fly first class, like it'll be cool to like connect with like relatives, because she's alone. But it turns out that this rich guy is Dracula, and he's trying to like gain his power. And I'm gonna have to spoil the ending of the movie because like it kind of pertains to like answering this question. But this woman, she's human, but she decides that she is going to drink his blood and become like this half vampire fledgling, and she uses her powers to destroy this colonial infrastructure, and like she kills all of them. And then the film ends with her like continuing to hunt the people that survived. So like absolutely gender roles can change. Absolutely. This woman uses vampiric things to like overthrow the masculine in that role. So yes.
Yeah, you find this is a rich discussion because in the chat box, the ARD, I don't know the full name, and he's suggesting he or she, they might be suggesting it happened to some extent in Rainfield, Nicolas Cage's Dracula. So maybe I've not happened to watch this.
Yeah, I haven't either. There's so many like new Dracula. Like there's the last voyage of the Demeter that I still really want to see, and then there's Renfield, and I think they haven't announced it, but someone on Twitter mentioned that Chloe Zhao is coming out with a new adaptation of Dracula with Robert Pattinson as Dracula, which I find so funny because of Robert Pattinson in Twilight.
Bella and Rebecca drive the plot. Anyways, thank you, ARD, and thank you, Danny. And I find the Victorian Sundays today, at least in the largest segment as well, it's a bridge between cultures. You find like Danny on a Sunday morning trying to speak to us on Dracula and like the nexus of sexuality. And in my background, I find like crackers crackling with all weird sounds and noises. So happy Diwali to Danny and all the participants and peers who have managed to join today's session. Thank you very much once again, Danny, for joining us here on Victorian Sundays. Hopefully, we'll have you soon again speaking on some of the topic.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I had such a blast talking about Dracula. I could talk about Dracula all day.
So, thank you, and hopefully, we'll be back with you in some other week talking more about Dracula and discussing the nuances that are related to Dracula. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. A very good night for all of us present here in India, and a very good morning. Enjoy your Sunday, Danny. Thank you once again. So, bye. I end the meeting here.